I raised my son to become the city's best surgeon. But then I heard him whisper late at night, "We have to delete the original records before the audit." I didn't believe my ears until I opened my late husband's wooden box and found the recording. He had let someone die and altered the files to cover it up. I once stayed silent for the sake of motherhood, but this time I chose the truth, even if it cost me everything. If you think this is just another family drama, you're wrong. Hit subscribe now to catch the most shocking and real episodes we've ever shared. When Margaret arrived at her son's house, the sky over Cypress Grove wore a dull, pearlescent gray, the kind of light that made everything feel suspended, like the day hadn't made up its mind yet. The taxi pulled up in front of a cream-colored townhouse tucked into the corner of a quiet, tree-lined street. The driver got out, opened the trunk, and stood there waiting. Margaret stepped out slowly. One hand gripped the worn strap of her leather purse. The other smoothed the front of her cardigan. Her movements weren't feeble, just careful. The kind of careful that comes from decades of holding things together when nobody else did. A single red nylon suitcase stood on the curb, faded, frayed at the seams, its airline tags dangling like tired ghosts from a life half-lived. Inside were 5 changes of clothes, a bottle of tiger balm, a bundle of letters tied with twine, and a small wooden box sanded smooth with time. Inside that box lay the last piece of her late husband that hadn't been buried, a brass button from the shirt he died in. She never sewed it back on. She kept it. The front door opened before she even rang the bell. "Mom," Daniel said, stepping out onto the porch. "You're early." Margaret looked up at her son. He had his father's frame, straight-backed, confident, but none of the warmth behind the eyes. "I was packed," she replied, her voice even. "Didn't see the point in sitting at home alone." Daniel descended the porch steps, lifted the suitcase with practiced ease, and motioned her inside. No hug, no hand on her shoulder, just a nod like she was being checked in for a long appointment. Inside, the air smelled like lemon polish and lilies. The floors shone, everything gleamed. On the wall was a framed photo of Daniel at a charity banquet tuxedo, crisp smile, flawless. Beside him stood Vanessa, all crimson dress and sharp angles. Her hand rested on Daniel's chest like a well-placed signature. Together they looked like people who never apologized for winning. Margaret removed her shoes without being asked. Quiet, careful. "Grandma," a voice called out from the top of the stairs. She turned. Lily, 17, stood on the landing, clutching a laptop to her chest. She had Vanessa's cheekbones and Daniel's eyes, though she didn't hold eye contact for long. There was a flicker of polite curiosity and then retreat. "You've grown," Margaret said with a soft smile. Lily nodded. "Mom said you'd be staying indefinitely." We cleared out the guest room. The word indefinitely landed hard. Before Margaret could respond, Lily had vanished upstairs. The guest room sat on the second floor, its windows facing a narrow row of bamboo. Daniel placed her suitcase down at the edge of the bed and gave his rehearsed run-down long hours at the hospital. Vanessa preparing for a major launch, Lily with exams and SAT prep. The household ran on fumes. Margaret nodded. "If you need anything," he said at the door. "I'll manage," she replied. He didn't close the door. It clicked shut all on its own. She stood in the center of the beige room for a long while. There were no books on the nightstand, no warmth in the linens, just efficiency. A room prepared, but not with welcome. She dropped to her knees, unzipped the suitcase, and pulled out the scarf-wrapped wooden box. The brass button lay inside, small, unchanged, steady. She pressed it to her chest and sat in silence. That night they ate dinner together. The dining table was long and gleaming, the kind you'd see in a showroom catalog. A white orchid centerpiece, flickering candles, everything elegant, precise, and utterly cold. Vanessa served butternut squash soup in matching porcelain bowls. She didn't look at Margaret once. "It's lovely to have you here," she said finally. "Hope the room's comfortable." "It's clean," Margaret said. "Mom's always been tidy," Daniel offered, sipping wine. Lily scrolled silently beneath the table, her fingers tapping out messages no one else could see. "So," Vanessa said, tone buttered with PR ease, "what will you do with your time here?" "I thought I might help out," Margaret replied. A pause, too long. "That's sweet," Vanessa said with a plastic smile, "but really just relax, enjoy retirement. I didn't come here to be waited on." Daniel glanced up from his plate. "Mom," he said gently but with weight, "maybe just ease into things. Lily has her own schedule. We're both under a lot of pressure. You really don't need to worry about anything." Twice now, Margaret thought. She folded her napkin, of course. After dinner, the family dispersed like fog. Vanessa returned to her tablet. Lily vanished. Daniel's office door clicked shut behind him. Margaret remained seated for a long time, watching the candle flame dwindle, its wax pooling slowly like melted time. Around midnight, thirsty, she padded downstairs barefoot. The house, pristine by day, now felt cold, unfamiliar. Passing Daniel's office, she slowed. Light spilled from beneath the door. Voices murmured on the other side. Shredded the backup, no signature, no liability. Silence. "I'm not letting this explode now. Keep the statement ready." Margaret held her breath. She backed away from the door like it might catch fire. Returned upstairs, her throat still dry. 2 mornings later, she sat on the back patio with a cup of tea and the brass button in her palm. Lily passed by, gym bag slung on one shoulder. "You always hold that thing," she said without slowing down. "It was your grandfather's," Margaret replied. "That little button." Margaret nodded. "Why keep a button?" "Because it was the last thing that came undone." Lily frowned, not mocking, not dismissive, just confused. Then she walked away. But before she disappeared inside, she glanced back over her shoulder. Just once. The days repeated themselves in quiet loops. Margaret folded napkins that weren't used, straightened picture frames that didn't need straightening, watched from windows that no one else looked through. She offered to cook. Vanessa insisted on meal kits. She offered to walk the dog. They didn't have one. She offered to tutor Lily. She has a private coach. Every offer landed like a feather dropped in a hurricane. She spoke less, watched more. Sometimes late at night, she'd see Daniel hunched over his laptop. Sometimes she'd see Vanessa whispering into a headset, pacing the hallway, arms crossed tight. And sometimes, when the silence in the house grew heavy enough, she'd hold the brass button and whisper into the dark, "I see you." She wasn't talking to anyone, but that didn't make it less true. She had not been invited to belong. She had been invited to forget, and that Margaret could not do. The days that followed Margaret's arrival unfolded with a quiet that wasn't peace. It was more like staged tranquility, the kind you find in furniture showrooms or the waiting room of a funeral home. Every object had its place. Every word felt rehearsed. Every person seemed busy avoiding something no one wanted to name. Margaret tried to make herself useful. On Monday morning, she woke before everyone else. The sun hadn't even breached the window blinds. She padded downstairs in slippers, the house still heavy with sleep, and brewed a pot of tea the way she had for 40 years, strong, no sugar, served in the porcelain set from her wedding. She found it wrapped in newspaper at the bottom of her suitcase. She had brought it not out of sentimentality, but because she wanted something real to hold on to in this museum of surfaces. By the time Daniel came down, hair-damp scrubs, crisp AirPods in, she had already set the table with toast and soft-boiled eggs. Vanessa emerged 15 minutes later, dressed like a magazine editor headed to war. Lily followed, eyes half-closed, earbuds buried deep. No one sat. Daniel poured himself coffee from the Nespresso. Vanessa grabbed a protein shake. Lily walked past the table without acknowledging it existed. Margaret smiled anyway. "I made breakfast." Daniel glanced over mid-scroll on his phone. "Thanks, Mom. But we're usually just grab and go in the mornings." "Oh," she said gently. "Maybe just on weekends then." Vanessa's expression didn't change, but something stiffened in her jaw. "We usually do brunch out. Lily likes the place on 6th with the avocado toast." Lily said nothing. Her gaze was somewhere far off, maybe in the song vibrating through her earbuds. Margaret sat down alone and ate the egg. She tried the laundry next. She found the hamper in the upstairs hallway, emptied it, and sorted the clothes with practiced hands. When she opened the digital washing machine, she stood blinking at the control panel. It looked like the cockpit of a Boeing. Still, after 20 minutes, she figured it out. Later that day, Vanessa came home, walked past the neatly folded laundry on the couch, and called out, "Margaret, Did you move Lily's jeans? They're in the second pile, Margaret replied, next to the whites. Pause. Oh, it's just Lily prefers her clothes air-dried. She didn't mention, Margaret said. Vanessa's voice turned sugar-sharp. It's okay. I'll take care of laundry from now on. We have a system. That night, Margaret sat on the edge of her bed holding the brass button. She didn't cry, but the air felt heavier, not in her lungs, in her silence. The walls weren't unfriendly, just indifferent, and indifference is lonelier than cruelty. Lily no longer looked at her directly. She answered questions with fine, I don't know, or maybe. She stopped coming downstairs unless summoned. Sometimes Margaret would hear her laugh, genuinely laugh, while FaceTiming with a friend. But when she entered the room, Lily's voice flattened like someone switching off the stereo. Margaret tried not to take it personally. She remembered being 17. Remembered the way her own daughter used to slam doors and roll eyes. But Lily wasn't angry. She wasn't even annoyed. She was absent, and that somehow was worse. So Margaret did what she'd learned to do long ago. She adapted. She retreated from the common spaces, occupied herself with the garden, took walks alone to the nearby lake, and talked mostly to herself or to the button in the box. One Thursday evening, the house was abnormally quiet. Daniel had canceled a dinner meeting citing fatigue. Vanessa hadn't come down since early afternoon. Margaret, having made herself a small dish of rice and sautéed greens, sat alone at the table eating in silence. The kitchen clock ticked like a metronome. She rinsed her plate, wiped the sink, and turned off the light. The house was dim, every room sealed like a vault. As she reached the second floor, a sliver of light caught her eye, the glow beneath Daniel's office door. She hadn't planned to stop, but she heard something, no, not something. A name. Yes, the Coy file. It needs to disappear before the auditors come in. Margaret froze. Daniel's voice was quiet but clipped urgent. They don't have the signature copy. Only the summary page. You made sure of that, right? Silence. Good, I don't want this blowing up right now. Her throat tightened. Another pause. We'll shred the backups tonight. There's no reason to let this hang any longer. She stood there for a full 15 seconds, not moving, not breathing, just listening. Then she turned slowly and walked back to her room. She sat on the bed with the box in her lap. Her hands didn't shake, but the room was no longer still. The shadows had changed. Hoy, she whispered. It wasn't a name she recognized, but the way Daniel had said it clipped cautious cold something in her knew it mattered. She placed the button back into the box, closed the lid, and stared at her reflection in the window. Outside, the bamboo swayed as if whispering secrets to the wind. Inside, Margaret felt the first ripple of something shift deep inside her chest. Not fear, doubt. And doubt, when it roots itself in a mother's mind, doesn't leave quietly. The next day, Daniel barely looked at her. She mentioned the weather. He nodded. She asked if Lily needed help with her college essay. He said she's working with a coach. Vanessa was worse. When she returned from a midday Pilates class, Margaret offered to warm up some tea. No thanks, she said, brushing past, trying to cut back on caffeine. It wasn't caffeine, it was conversation. Margaret watched her disappear up the stairs like a ghost in Lululemon. In the garden, Margaret clipped dead leaves from a rosemary bush and tried to remember the last time she'd heard her son laugh, not chuckle, not perform politeness, but laugh. She couldn't remember. Maybe it was in college when he came home after finals and collapsed on the couch with a sandwich too big for one hand. Or maybe earlier when he was 8 and tried to build a rocket from soda bottles. She missed that boy. She didn't know this man. That night, Lily knocked on the guest room door. Margaret was brushing her hair. Lily lingered at the threshold, half in, half out, like a cat deciding whether it wanted affection or escape. Do you know what time Grandpa died? Margaret blinked at the question. Why? I'm just curious. Margaret nodded. 2:13 in the morning. The nurse called me right after. Did you see him before? I did, she said. He was tired, but he smiled. He said something strange. What? Margaret smiled faintly. It's not the end that scares me, it's what gets rewritten after. Lily looked confused. Then that's kind of cool, weird, but cool. She turned to go, then stopped. You're not like Mom. Margaret tilted her head. No, you listen. Then she was gone. The door eased shut. Margaret sat down on the edge of her bed and placed the button in her palm. That ripple inside her had become a current now. She didn't yet know where it led. But she knew this much. Something in this house was being rewritten, and it wasn't the past. It was the truth. The house was quiet that afternoon, too quiet. That brand of silence that felt manufactured, like someone had scrubbed all the sound out of it with bleach. Margaret stood in the guest room staring at the narrow dresser. Something about it had been pulling at her for days. Not the dresser itself, but the box she'd placed on top of it. The wooden one, sanded smooth over decades. Her husband's box. She reached for it now, fingers pausing just before they made contact, as if touching it might open something far more dangerous than wood and brass. The lid creaked when she opened it. Inside, the button polished slightly from how often she held it. But today something new glinted beneath the silk lining. A USB drive. Small, metal, no label, just a single red mark from a Sharpie across one edge. She didn't remember packing it, which meant her husband had placed it there before he passed, intentionally. Margaret stared at the drive for a full minute before standing. She tucked the box under her arm and walked out of the room like a woman heading into court. Lily's laptop sat on the kitchen counter, plugged in, unlocked. YouTube paused mid-makeup tutorial. Margaret hesitated for only a second before clicking out and plugging in the USB. 2 files. No title, no timestamps. Just rec1.mp3 and doc backup PDF. She opened the audio file. The voice that filled the speakers was Daniel's. Calm, controlled, calculated. Procedure was scheduled for 3:45. Patient Coy V. Initial report claimed ventricular damage, but actual cause accidental incision to lower hepatic vein. Team froze. No code called for 7 minutes. Margaret felt her stomach flip. The recording continued. We wrote it as respiratory failure due to cardiac shock. It was that or get sued. Head of risk approved it. No one objected. They shredded the original surgical notes. Told the mother he went peacefully. A pause. Then quieter. I know it was wrong. But they would have destroyed my career. And the hospital can't take another scandal. Click, end. Margaret didn't move. Didn't breathe. Her son. Her only child. A man with degrees, awards, and photo spreads in medical journals had lied about the death of a patient. Had stood over a young man's cooling body and falsified the record. The PDF was no better. A surgical log with edits made in red, crossed out vitals, adjusted timelines. A signed release from the head of risk. The cover page stamped confidential. She removed the USB and closed the laptop. Her hands weren't shaking, but something inside her had begun to slip. Margaret sat in the garden for an hour, staring into the rosemary bushes. When she was a teacher, she used to tell her students that truth wasn't just about what you say, it was also about what you choose to hide. Back then, she believed it. She taught literature and ethics, emphasized honor, responsibility, the weight of words, told teenagers that their future depended on their character, not just their grades. Now, her son, raised in her house with those very lessons printed into his bones, had turned those words into ash. She thought of Mr. Coy. She didn't know his face, didn't know his age, didn't know whether he had a wife, a mother, a son. But she knew one thing now: Daniel had robbed someone of truth, and in doing so, robbed that family of peace. And she had evidence, solid, devastating. The brass button for once stayed in her pocket. She didn't want to hold it. Not right now, not when the memory it carried had begun to rot. That night, dinner was chicken with lemon glaze and steamed greens. Vanessa had ordered it from their favorite fusion place and transferred it to ceramic dishes before Margaret came down her usual trick to feign effort. Daniel sat at the head of the table, work phone to the left of his plate. Vanessa poured wine with the precision of someone who hated wasting a drop. Lily scrolled under the table, pretending no one else existed. Margaret said nothing during the first 10 minutes. Then halfway through the meal, she folded her napkin. I had a student once, she said calmly. Bright boy. Wanted to be a surgeon. Wrote an essay about how medicine was the most honest profession because every life you held was a contract with truth. Vanessa looked up. Oh, yes, Margaret continued. He said doctors couldn't afford to lie, that even one slip could ripple through generations. Daniel paused, fork midair. Margaret turned to him, gaze steady. Do you remember a patient named Coy? The name landed like a shard of glass in the center of the table. Daniel's expression didn't change. But Vanessa froze. Her wine glass halted mid-lift. Her eyes darted to Daniel, then back to her plate. The silence was thick, not awkward, not confused, guilty. Lily glanced up for the first time, sensing the shift. "Hoy," Daniel said slowly, like chewing on a foreign word. "That was a long time ago." Margaret nodded. Sometimes things from long ago have a way of resurfacing. Vanessa set down her glass. "I'm sure you're tired, Margaret," she said too quickly. "You've had a lot on your mind." Margaret's voice was razor sharp. "Not as much as Daniel has." Daniel exhaled finally. "Mom, if this is about something you heard, I'd suggest we talk privately." "I'm sure you would," she said. No one ate after that. The sound of forks scraping plates had vanished. Only the air remained stale, thin, charged. Later that night in her room, Margaret sat by the lamp holding the wooden box. The USB was inside. So was the brass button. 2 legacies from 2 men. One spoke of love memory truth. The other was a warning. She thought of her former students, the ones who sat wide-eyed as she taught them about moral courage. Then she thought of the mother who never got the truth about her son's death. And for the first time since moving in, she didn't feel like a guest. She felt like a witness. And witnesses eventually have to speak. The thunder came without warning. It wasn't the theatrical kind, no slow build, no distant grumble, just a sudden crack that rattled the window pane like a threat. Margaret stood by the kitchen sink, washing her teacup, the only sound besides the rain pelting the glass. She heard the footsteps behind her before she turned, heavy, fast, angry. "Vanessa," arms crossed, jaw clenched, voice sharp. "We need to talk." Margaret dried her hands and turned slowly. Vanessa didn't wait. "What exactly are you trying to do?" The question hung in the air, sour and unearned. "I don't follow," Margaret said even. "Oh, you follow just fine," Vanessa snapped. "Don't play the innocent matriarch act. You've been whispering things, asking questions, bringing up old names at the table like you're digging graves in my dining room." Margaret didn't flinch. "Your dining room?" "Yes," Vanessa said, stepping forward. "My home, mine. I work for it, I pay for it. I built this life while your son saved lives. You retired. You came here to die quietly, and instead you're stirring shit like it's your last project." The words sliced, but Margaret had heard sharper. She just never thought they'd come from someone who once called her mom over Thanksgiving turkey. A door opened behind them. "Daniel." He stepped in face blank. That surgeon calm, the mask of someone trained to hold a heart in one hand and a scalpel in the other and never let it shake. "Let it." "Vanessa," he said. "Give us a moment." Vanessa scoffed. "No, I'm done pretending she's harmless." Daniel looked at Margaret, then at the floor, and then finally back up. "Mom," he said, "you've been confused lately." The word landed like a slap. Margaret straightened, confused. He continued, voice low, almost rehearsed. "It happens. At your age, memory slips. You start connecting things that don't fit, drawing lines that aren't there." "You think I imagined that recording?" she asked, incredulous. "I think you found something you didn't understand, something that wasn't yours to interpret." Vanessa jumped back in. "You're accusing your own son of murder, Margaret. Based on what? An audio file? A file you could have misunderstood, or maybe you just needed to feel important again." Something in Margaret's chest cracked, but it didn't break. It solidified. She stepped forward. "I know what I heard," she said, "and I know what kind of man I raised. That's why it hurts." Daniel's lips tightened. "Then maybe it's best if you took some time, got some help, somewhere quiet." There it was. Not a suggestion, a push, an exile. Margaret looked at both of them. This house, so cold, so beautiful, was a mausoleum of silence, and she'd had enough of pretending she didn't see the bodies buried beneath the hardwood floors. She didn't answer. She simply turned and walked past them. She packed slowly, not because she was uncertain, but because she knew this was it. Every sweater folded was a closing chapter. Every book slipped into the suitcase was a refusal to forget. She placed the wooden box on top, nestled it in scarves like a sacred relic. The USB was still inside. So was the brass button. When she zipped the case, she felt no grief, only gravity. A knock came, soft, hesitant. "Lily." She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, hoodie too large, eyes unreadable. "You're leaving?" she asked. "I am," Margaret said. Lily looked down. "They told me you were confused." "Do I sound confused?" Lily shrugged. "You don't, but they always say things so confidently, like facts." Margaret nodded. "Confidence isn't the same as truth." There was a long pause. Then Lily stepped forward, awkward, unsure. She didn't hug Margaret, just stood there, quiet. "I'm sorry," she said, "for how I've been." "You're 17, Margaret said. "You weren't supposed to fix this." Lily leaned down, picked up a pen from the desk, and scribbled something on a small, folded receipt from her hoodie pocket. Then she slid it between the folded shirts in the suitcase tucked deep like a secret note in class. She didn't say what it was, didn't explain, just looked at her grandmother one last time and whispered good luck. Margaret cupped her face briefly. "Be better than all of us." The rain hadn't stopped. A cold, slanted storm poured down as she wheeled the suitcase down the driveway. No one followed. No porch light flicked on. No apology came racing through the door. Just the sound of water hitting cement, the wind whipping through cypress trees. She hailed a cab. The driver didn't ask questions, just looked in the rearview mirror once before pulling off. She didn't look back at the house, not once. Instead, she opened the suitcase, moved a scarf aside, and pulled out Lily's note. The handwriting was shaky, but the words hit like thunder. "If you don't believe yourself, who will?" Margaret stared at the ink until it blurred. Then she pressed the note flat, slid it inside the wooden box next to the button in the USB, and shut it with a soft final click. It was no longer a box of memory. It was evidence, and she wasn't a guest anymore. She was a witness, and she was going to war. The rain was still coming down hard, tapping on the window like a persistent thought Margaret couldn't shake. She sat at the edge of the bed in the dimly lit hotel room, the same wooden box resting in her lap, the brass button warm in her palm, like a pulse that didn't belong to her. A memory, a guilt, a key. The USB drive lay beside it, its silver frame cold and clinical. She stared at the phone on the nightstand, then picked it up and dialed. The line rang once, twice. Then, "Yeah, Thomas, it's Margaret." A beat. "Margaret, Jesus, it's been... what, 10 years? 11, she said. "Listen, I need help. I wouldn't call if it wasn't serious." Something in her voice must have landed. He didn't ask questions. "Where are you?" "Blue Maple Hotel, room 213. I'll be there in 20. Click. She stared at the wall, the paint cracked near the ceiling. She hadn't noticed that before. Thomas arrived in 17 minutes. He looked older. Gray at the temples, the shoulder sling bag worn, but his eyes were still sharp, those of a man who'd chased truth through burned archives and late-night courtrooms. Former investigative journalist exiled from 3 networks still carried a notepad in his coat. "You weren't lying," he said, stepping in and brushing rain off his jacket. "You look like hell." Margaret gave him a faint smile. "I feel worse." He sat opposite her, eyeing the box. "That it?" She nodded. USB inside, audio file, hospital cover-up, patient named Kevin. He opened the drive like a priest revealing relics, plugged it into his tablet, pressed play. They sat in silence as Daniel's voice echoed across the tiny room. Precise, sterile, confessional. When it ended, Thomas exhaled slow and low. "Jesus Christ. I know." He pulled out a cigarette, then put it away without lighting it. "You sure this isn't some training log?" Simulated voice. "There's a copy of the redacted surgical file, too. PDF. She showed him. He scrolled. "Damn, this was never meant to survive." "That's why I called you," she said. "I need you to dig." Discreetly. Kevin's full name is Kevin V. He died on the table. They told his wife it was cardiac arrest. Thomas narrowed his eyes. "The widow?" Margaret nodded. "We need to find her." Thomas opened his laptop. Fingers moved fast. After 20 minutes, he looked up. Kevin V. Died in operation 3 years ago. Wife's name Linda V. Born 1984. Used to work in HR. 1 son, age 9. Disappeared shortly after payout from the hospital. Margaret leaned in. They paid her. Settlement. No formal court case, but the money trail's there. Private arbitration. Silent clause buried under 3 layers of legalese. He turned the screen to her. She lives in Glen Ridge now, works at a flower shop. Still uses her maiden name sometimes. Margaret's stomach dropped. They bought her silence. Thomas nodded. "But silence doesn't mean peace. We'll go see her tomorrow." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. The rain had stopped, but the storm was still inside her. She paced, replayed the audio, reread the PDF. Every line felt colder than the last. Her son's voice wasn't just distant, it was foreign, like listening to a language she used to know distorted by time and betrayal. Around 2 a.m. her phone buzzed. A message. From Lily. No words, just a photo. The brass button. Margaret stared at it, heart thudding. Her granddaughter had gone into her old room, opened the drawer, found what she left behind. Another message followed. I believe you. Just 3 words, but it cracked something open in her chest. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, but Margaret couldn't feel it. She and Thomas drove through the outskirts of town, passing fields half-bloomed and roads too quiet for spring. The flower shop sat on the corner of a small plaza, petal and vine, hand-painted sign, white curtains in the window. They parked. Thomas looked at her. You ready? No, she said. But that never stopped me before. They walked in together. The bell chimed. Behind the counter, a woman in her late 30s looked up. Her hands were covered in rose dust and ribbon. Her face was worn, beautiful, exhausted. Can I help? She stopped. Something in Margaret's eyes made her go still. Linda V. Thomas asked gently. She didn't answer. Margaret stepped forward. I knew your husband, Kevin. I was his surgeon's mother. Linda stared. You're Daniel's mother. Margaret nodded. There was a long pause. Then get out. We're not here to harm you, Thomas said quickly. Just talk. You people talked enough when they handed me a check and a lawyer. I know, Margaret said. That's why I'm here. Linda hesitated. Margaret reached into her purse, held out the USB in her palm. This is his voice, my son's, admitting what he did. Silence. Linda took the USB like it was radioactive. I don't want revenge, Margaret said. But I can't let it stay buried. Linda looked down. My son still asks where his father went. I told him, heaven. But lately he asks if heaven takes people who died because someone made a mistake. Margaret's throat closed. I tell him yes, Linda continued, because I don't know what else to say. Thomas pulled out his notepad. Would you be willing to talk on record? Linda didn't answer right away. Then she looked at Margaret. Really looked. You're risking your family for this. Margaret didn't blink. I already lost what mattered. All that's left is truth. Linda stared at her, then nodded. Back at the hotel, Thomas backed up the audio, copied the PDF to multiple encrypted drives, printed the signed affidavit from Linda. It was short but powerful. Margaret sat quietly as he worked the hum of the printer, like the ticking of a bomb no one else could hear. When he finished, he looked at her. You ready for what comes next? No, she said again. But it's time. She picked up the wooden box. It no longer felt like a memory. It felt like a weapon. The knock came just after dusk. Margaret was seated by the window, a cup of cold chamomile tea untouched on the sill, her thoughts drifting somewhere between dread and conviction. The hotel hallway was quiet, the kind of quiet that made you second-guess every decision leading up to now. The knock again, softer this time, almost shy. She opened the door. Lily stood there, drenched from the light rain, her hoodie hanging off one shoulder backpack slipping down one arm. No umbrella. Just a look in her eyes that Margaret had never seen before. Can I come in? Lily asked. Margaret stepped aside without a word. Lily walked past her into the room, dropped her bag by the foot of the bed, and stood for a moment taking it all in. The plain walls, the lamp with its yellowed shade, the open folder on the desk labeled confidential. Mom thinks I'm at a sleepover, Lily said flatly. She wouldn't notice if I wasn't. Margaret turned toward her slowly. What are you doing here? I found something. Lily pulled her backpack open and took out a hard drive wrapped in a sock. She unwrapped it carefully, set it on the desk like it was fragile. It was in Dad's study. He always hides stuff in boring places. I looked inside the folder labeled Conference Slides 2019. Thought it'd be empty, but it wasn't. She plugged it into Margaret's laptop without waiting. A folder appeared on screen. Kevin Original Report. Inside scans of handwritten surgical notes, time-stamped discrepancies, redacted autopsy entries, and a hidden audio memo. One Daniel had recorded privately. They played it. Daniel's voice came through again, quieter this time, unguarded. I don't know how much longer I can keep the story straight. The resident froze. I made the cut. It was too deep, too fast. I saw the blood, Jesus, I knew right away. We waited, covered. Kevin was gone in 3 minutes, and I let them sign off the false sheet. I signed it too. The audio ended. Lily stepped back, trembling. I thought Dad was a hero, she said quietly. I thought, whatever you were doing, maybe you were wrong. Her face crumpled. Then the tears came. Margaret stepped forward, arms trembling, and held her, really held her for the first time in years. Lily sobbed into her shoulder. He lied. About everything. They sat on the bed in silence for a long time, the night curling around them like a curtain. Later, with tissues piled on the nightstand and Lily wrapped in a hotel blanket, she spoke again. I want to help, but I can't use my name. If Mom finds out, if anyone at school... You want to testify anonymously? Margaret asked. Lily nodded. I want to be a ghost, but a useful one. Margaret smiled gently through the ache. You're braver than you think. But am I doing the right thing? Lily asked. He's still my dad. Margaret paused. That question didn't have a clean answer. He's my son, she said. And I've been asking myself the same thing every day. They looked at each other. Mirror images from different lifetimes, one still forming the other, trying not to collapse. I have to ask, Margaret said, voice thin. If I go through with this, it could kill what's left of our family. There won't be any going back. Lily didn't hesitate. Then let it die, if it was built on a lie. The next morning, Margaret printed the documents. 3 folders. One for the Department of Health, one for the local newspaper, the Concord Ledger, and one she placed inside the wooden box beside the brass button. A keepsake not of nostalgia now, but of conscience. She walked to the corner print and mail shop alone. Lily stayed behind, curled up on the bed, headphones and gaze locked on the window. The clerk barely glanced up as Margaret handed him the envelopes. 1 certified, she said. 2 priority. He weighed them. Typed something. Anything fragile? No, she said, just truth. That night Margaret couldn't sleep. The storm had returned, but it no longer frightened her. It was in some strange way a comfort, because now finally it sounded like the world outside was just as angry as the world within, and for once she didn't feel alone. The morning the story broke, the sky was overcast, heavy with accusation. Margaret sat in her small hotel room, news reports looping on the TV. The headline crawled across the bottom in bold red letters. Prominent surgeon under fire. Allegations of concealing medical malpractice surface. Her name hadn't been mentioned, not yet. But the tone, quiet commentary law experts, concerned anchors, was unmistakable. Her phone vibrated. It was Lily. Grandma, it's everywhere. Margaret stared at the screen, heart thudding. The first threads had been sent yesterday evening to the Department of Health and the Concord Ledger. Today those threads had unraveled into a full-blown media storm. By late morning the story reached national sites. The Ledger article was prominently featured. Breaking. Surgeon Daniel Hayes faces allegations after whistleblower. His own mother sends documents to state health authorities. Hospital halts all procedures pending investigation. There it was. Hospital suspended. Daniel stripped of credentials pending review. Investigators swarming the surgical wing. Margaret watched Daniel's face on screen. He looked smaller, aging before her eyes, suit crumpled eyes darting like trapped birds. At noon, another shock: private legal filings surfaced online. Daniel and Vanessa Hayes had countersued Margaret. The claims: defamation, invasion of privacy, malicious intent. They demanded damages, retraction, a public apology. Margaret felt something shift inside her. The walls of fear she'd built around herself cracked. She turned off the TV. Lily appeared at the door, determination behind mascara-smudged eyes. She carried a homemade sign. Truth is not a crime. Grandma, she said, voice fierce. They can't scare us. Margaret nodded. She'd been counting on that fire. By late afternoon, they held the press conference in the hotel conference room, borrowed, rented, unpolished. A makeshift podium, a standing lamp, stacks of documents. The room was packed. Local reporters, online journalists, a cameraman who set up in the corner, phones out, recorders on. Margaret stepped to the microphone. She looked out across the crowd, mostly strangers, but their eyes held the same thirst. Thank you, she began, voice calm but firm. My name is Margaret Hayes. I am the whistleblower who exposed the death of Kevin V., a patient my son mistakenly operated on. Gasps trailed through the room. She paused. My purpose is not revenge. My purpose is truth. And with me today is my granddaughter, Lily Hayes. Lily stepped forward. Her legs trembled, but her voice didn't. Hello. I'm Lily. I found original medical records that contradict the hospital story. I stand here today to affirm what my grandmother revealed is factual. Another hush. Reporters sprang to life, flashing bulbs, rapid questions. Lily, were you afraid to come forward? Margaret. Do you feel responsible for your son's reputation? Why now? After all this time, Lily spoke first. I was afraid. Of losing my father, of being hated. But I realized something telling the truth isn't betrayal. It's accountability, Margaret added. I tried silence first. I gave my son space, but it became clear that silence was compliance, and I cannot live with compliance. Then came the anonymous nurse, tall mid-30s scrubs under a trench coat. She stepped onto the little stage, voice low. My name is not important, she said, but I was the surgical ward nurse that night. I was told to delete the original records, told to sign off on the falsified report. I was scared to go against orders, but I was also ashamed. She looked at Margaret, then at the crowd. Thank you for giving me courage. The conference ended under applause, but the air remained charged. Questions hung. Would Lily be protected? Could Margaret withstand a lawsuit? Would the nurse face retaliation? Late that night, Margaret and Lily sat in the darkened room, phones off. The storm outside had returned, wind rattling shutters, rain spattering. They held hands. I wasn't ready for how fast this got real, Margaret whispered. Lily squeezed her hand. You did it. We did it. Margaret closed her eyes. She thought of Daniel, her son, now a defendant. Of Vanessa standing behind him. She thought of what she'd risked, their relationship, their family. Do you think we'll regret this? Lily gave a quiet laugh. Regret, hiding the truth. Never. Back in his home, Daniel stared at the lawsuit papers. Vanessa paced the hallway. Their alliance had faltered. The sinking realization facing her mother-in-law wasn't just a legal battle, it was moral, existential. They would fight, but Margaret was already beyond fear. In the dark hotel room, grandmother and granddaughter listened to the storm, and for once the thunder sounded like justice breaking free. The courtroom smelled like old wood and cold air, polished benches, dull brass fixtures, and a silence so taut you could pluck it like a wire. Margaret stood at the plaintiff's table, hands folded calmly, dressed in dark blue, not black, not mourning. Dignity, not sorrow. Across from her, Daniel sat rigid, his suit perfect, jaw tight. Vanessa, seated beside him, wouldn't even meet her mother-in-law's eyes. Her betrayal was complete now. She had turned her body, her loyalty, her name away. The bailiff called the room to order. All rise. The judge entered, gray-haired, slow, with the air of someone who'd seen too much truth twisted under oath. And so it began. Opening arguments blurred by like wind through a tunnel. Legal strategies, technical denials, procedural jargon. But Margaret wasn't here for the mechanics. She was here for the reckoning. When it was her turn, she stood slowly walking to the witness stand with the same quiet grace she had once used to walk down school corridors back when she still taught ethics. The courtroom watched. I am Margaret Hayes, she said, her voice clear, no hint of tremble. Mother of the defendant, retired educator, widow. She paused, looked straight at the jury, and for a long time a coward. Gasps rippled faintly. I stayed silent when I knew something was wrong. I stayed silent because I loved my son, because I told myself that protecting him was the same as protecting what was right. She inhaled. But love without truth isn't love, it's complicity. Someone in the jury dabbed at a tear. I raised my son to be a healer, but what I saw, what I heard was not healing. It was covering, hiding, erasing. She reached into her bag and pulled out the brass button, placed it on the table. This belonged to my husband. The last button on his favorite coat. He died with it in his pocket. I carry it because it reminds me that character is what we carry with us, especially when no one else is looking. She looked to the defense table. Daniel, I still love you, but I can't lie for you anymore. When Lily took the stand, the room stiffened. She was young, too young for this, but her voice didn't crack. My name is Lily Hayes. I'm 17, and I found the original files records that contradict the official story of what happened to Mr. Kevin V. I'm not here because I hate my father. I'm here because I watched my grandmother choose what was right over what was easy, and I believe we all have to do the same. Her eyes met Daniel's just for a moment. He didn't blink, but Lily did, then turned away. The cross-examinations were brutal. Daniel's attorney tried to paint Margaret as delusional, a grieving old woman clinging to conspiracy. He called her parenting into question, her vendetta, her mental fragility. But the facts stood. The tape, the nurse's anonymous testimony, the conflicting timestamps. The silence of the hospital's PR department spoke louder than any denial. Outside public opinion split like glass under pressure. Some hailed Margaret as a hero, a woman who chose conscience over blood. Others called her a traitor to her own family. Talk shows debated her every word. Hashtags warred. Op-eds were written with venom and veneration. But one question had begun to form in the collective consciousness. What else was the hospital hiding? As the day ended and court adjourned, Daniel didn't look at Margaret, didn't look at Lily. He walked past them silent. Vanessa closed behind a face like stone. But Margaret didn't cry, because deep in her chest, where grief used to bloom, something steadier had begun to root itself. A quiet belief in integrity, even if it came at the cost of everything else. The courtroom was heavy with breathless silence as the verdict was read. Dr. Daniel Hayes, guilty of medical misconduct, falsification of medical records, and obstruction of a state health audit. The gavel hit, not with drama, with finality. Daniel sat still like the sentence hadn't landed yet. His hands didn't twitch, his lips didn't part. But his eyes, those once commanding eyes that had scanned surgical charts and seduced boards, looked small. The judge continued. License to practice medicine is hereby revoked. A 5-year suspended sentence is imposed contingent on completion of federal oversight. A fine of $125 million is levied effective immediately. No applause, no gasps. Just breath held and released. Vanessa didn't reach for him. She just stood, brushed invisible lint off her jacket, and walked out. High heels tapping across the marble floor like a verdict of their own. The headlines the next day were cruel. Golden surgeon falls from grace. Whistleblower. Mother destroys medical empire. PR queen abandons sinking ship. Vanessa lost her job within 24 hours. The agency she helmed cited conflict of ethical standing and released a 6-word statement, "We no longer represent Mrs. Hayes." Nobody returned her calls. Former clients ghosted. Sponsors dropped. Her own staff unfollowed her on LinkedIn. Her once curated public image, sharp blazers, TEDx panels, filtered lighting crumbled under the weight of betrayal by proximity. Margaret didn't celebrate. She read the verdict in quiet alone at her kitchen table, Lily across from her eating oatmeal like it was any Tuesday. "Are you okay?" Lily asked softly. Margaret looked up. "No," she said, "but I'm right." Lily nodded. "That's better." They didn't hug, they didn't cry, but something passed between them, a silent contract. Shared values. A beginning disguised as aftermath. Later that week, the house Daniel once called home was listed for sale. Frozen accounts, legal fees, civil suits from other patients emboldened by Kevin's case. Vanessa had moved back in with her sister in Denver. Daniel rented a 1-bedroom near the airport. And Lily, she packed her bags one quiet morning, walked out without confrontation. No slamming doors, no shouting matches. Just a note on the kitchen counter that read, "You asked me to be strong. I am." At Margaret's place, she opened the door without hesitation. No questions. "Just your room's ready." Lily dropped her backpack. For the first time in years, she felt like a person instead of a project. They cooked dinner together, simple food, over-steamed broccoli, slightly burnt rice. Margaret turned to Lily as they rinsed dishes. "Your grandfather once said, when something precious breaks, you don't hide the cracks. You fill them with gold." Lily blinked. "That sounds expensive." Margaret smiled. "Truth always is." It started over tea. Not a plan, not a grand mission, just tea. Margaret had just refilled Lily's cup when she said, "You know, there must be others." Lily blinked. Others, other families, other Kevins, victims whose names never made the paper, whose truth never reached a courtroom. Lily looked down, stirred sugar into her cup with a shaking spoon. "You want to help them." Margaret nodded slowly, not out of guilt, but because now we know what to look for. What to ask, how to hold a hand without letting go halfway. Lily sat back, her eyes sharpened. "I can build a website, map stories, let people share without being exposed. And I'll write letters," Margaret said. "Speak at hospitals, schools, wherever someone will listen." They brainstormed names, some too formal, others too sentimental. Then Lily's gaze landed on the old wooden box on the counter, the brass button. Margaret followed her eyes. That she smiled. "That's just a piece of my past." "No," Lily said. "That's the reason we're here." 2 weeks later, the website launched. The Brass Button Fund. A refuge for medical whistleblowers, patient families, and anonymous staff. anyone silenced by fear, shame, or corporate power. Their mission was simple. Truth shouldn't be a luxury. Integrity shouldn't be a punishment. They received 27 emails in the first 3 days. A nurse from Oregon fired after refusing to alter a death certificate. A janitor in Dallas who overheard surgeons falsifying anesthesia logs. A woman in Tennessee who lost her sister after a surgical sponge was left inside her abdomen and was paid $20,000 to let it go. Margaret read each one. Lily cataloged encrypted followed up. They didn't solve everything, but they listened. And for many, that was the first miracle. Media caught on quickly. CNN asked for an interview. Margaret declined. "We're not here to be famous. We're here to be useful." But Lily agreed to do a podcast, anonymous voice face blurred. She ended it with one line, "Sometimes your family falls apart so someone else's can stay whole." That night, Margaret walked past Lily's room, paused at the door. Inside, Lily was sketching website wireframes, talking softly on her headset to a volunteer from Minnesota. Margaret stood there for a moment longer. She didn't say anything. She just listened. And in that silence, she realized legacy wasn't what you leave behind. It's what you fight to leave standing. Autumn came early that year. The leaves on Margaret Street turned copper and flame before the rest of the town had even unpacked their jackets. Some days the wind carried the scent of apples and old wood, others only the hush of endings. One Sunday morning, Lily stepped onto the porch holding a small box. "What's this?" Margaret asked. "A thank you." Inside, a pin shaped like a brass button but engraved with a single word, "Begin." Margaret held it in her palm like it was something fragile. "It's for you," Lily said, "to remind you it didn't end here." Margaret smiled, lips trembling. "It never does," she whispered. That afternoon they visited the park together. No speeches, no banners. Just a bench, 2 coffees, and a little plaque they had asked the city to approve, in memory of those whose stories were never told, and in honor of those brave enough to tell them. The Brass Button Fund. A couple walked by and paused to read it. They didn't know Margaret. They didn't recognize Lily, but they nodded quietly before moving on like the message belonged to everyone. And that, Margaret realized, was the point. That night, as the house settled and shadows stretched across the floor, Margaret sat at the window, the brass pin in her hand. She thought of Daniel, of the boy who used to color pictures of skeletons, fascinated by anatomy before he could even spell it. She thought of the man he became, the walls, the ambition, the silence. She still loved him, but some silences she had learned should never be inherited. In the dark, she whispered, "I broke us to save you from breaking others." And then, as if the world was listening, the wind brushed past the glass, soft, resolute, and very much alive. The acceptance letter came on a quiet Tuesday. It wasn't dramatic. Just a soft ping on Lily's laptop mid-morning while she sipped lukewarm tea and scrolled through patient rights journals. She opened the email, read the words, then read them again. "Congratulations. You've been accepted to the Department of Medical Ethics, University of Washington. Full scholarship. Fall term begins August 15th. She didn't cry. She closed the laptop, stood, walked to the kitchen where Margaret was chopping carrots. "Grandma," she said softly. Margaret turned, saw the look, knew. "You got in?" Lily nodded. Margaret put the knife down. Didn't say anything for a long time. Just reached forward and pulled her granddaughter into the safest hug the world could offer. Later that night they sat together on the back porch. The sun was bruising the sky purple and gold. Cicadas hummed in the distance. Margaret rocked gently in her chair. "You're going to change things, you know." Lily shrugged. "I'll just be one voice." Margaret smiled. "Voices are seeds. You just have to plant them in the right place." Lily was quiet, then whispered, "Was it worth it, Grandma?" "Everything we lost." Margaret looked out across the yard where fireflies blinked like slow signals. "We didn't lose," she said. "We traded." That night, Margaret stayed up writing. The pen moved slowly, her hands stiff, but her mind sharp as ever. The letter she wrote was not for the press, not for court, not for the world. It was for her husband. Voiceover begins. Margaret reading her letter over slow, silent images of Lily packing for school. "My love, I know it's been years, and I've written you 1,000 times in my head, but tonight I needed paper. I did what I promised you once I never would. I exposed our son. I stood against him, spoke against him. I couldn't save him, John. I tried. But love, real love, sometimes means holding someone accountable even if it shatters you. You always said a parent's job wasn't to protect children from the world, but to prepare them to walk through it with decency. I failed that, didn't I? But maybe not completely. Because our granddaughter, she stood with me. She'll carry us forward. She'll carry you. I didn't betray you. I honored you the only way I knew how. Through truth, through courage, through her. Love always, Margaret. Cut to the airport. Lily walked through the terminal, a lone suitcase in one hand, a small wooden box in the other. She wore no makeup, no dramatics, just quiet resolve. Her boarding pass trembled slightly in her fingers. She found a seat by the window, sat, waited. She opened the box slowly. Inside, the brass button glinted against soft cloth, not shiny, not polished, but steady, real. She held it in her palm, turned it gently. Sunlight broke through the glass, caught the brass just right. And for a moment the button gleamed like a lighthouse, like memory, like a promise. Back home, Margaret stood by the empty doorframe where Lily had just waved goodbye. The house was quieter now, but not hollow. She turned toward the window and smiled. The park was quieter than she remembered. Margaret walked alone down the gravel path, past benches softened by time, past a rusted swing that creaked without wind. She wore her late husband's old scarf, the ends faded but still warm. In her hand was a small wooden box. She paused at the oak tree. It stood exactly where it always had, stubborn and sprawling. Its roots had lifted the path slightly over the years, forcing joggers and strollers to veer around it, a quiet resistance. She touched the bark. It felt older than her. From the box she took out the brass button. She held it between her fingers, turned it in the light. The sun caught the engraving Lily had added months earlier. Begin. Margaret knelt slowly, her knees groaning a protest, and pressed the button into the soft soil near the tree's base. A goodbye, a symbol, a seed. Then she rose, brushed her hands clean, and stood in silence for a long while. Across the screen in black letters over golden morning light, inspired by events that could happen in real life. Cut to a cafe in Amsterdam. Lily sat with a laptop open, headphones on. She was mid-sentence animated, presenting to a small class of young researchers. And that's why informed consent isn't just a legal form, it's a moral contract. If we compromise that, we compromise everything. The professor beside her smiled. Later, walking alone along the canal, she opened her email. One message waited from home. Subject: Your garden looks taller. It was from Margaret. Inside, a simple note. I heard your voice in the background of a documentary this week. You didn't name me, but I knew. I knew it was your fire and your light. The house is quiet, but the tree in the yard has started blooming early. Maybe it's just spring, or maybe it remembers too. Attached was a photo, Margaret standing in her small backyard, watering a potted plant. Behind her, the oak tree towered in quiet witness. Her smile was soft content, not triumphant, not tragic, just full. Cut to Margaret's home. She moved through the space like someone no longer haunted. The walls were still the same. The shelves still held the same books. But there was something lighter in the way she moved, like the house finally breathed with her, instead of against her. A breeze swept through the open window. She stood at the back door, looking out at the garden. The leaves shimmered in the light. And then she spoke, not to anyone in particular, not to the camera, just out loud. A new chapter begins, and this time I will not be silent. She closed the door behind her, and the screen faded to black.